The canyon had no names. It sat at the edge of the Calvary Reach, where the land split open like a wound that had never healed, dropping thousands of feet into shadow and mist. No cartographer had ever bothered to mark it on any map. No village had ever been built near its rim. Even the wind seemed to avoid it, sliding around the chasm as though the earth itself was holding its breath, afraid to disturb whatever lived at the bottom. Because something did live at the bottom. The shepherds in the distant valleys knew. They had names for it, none of them kind. They whispered about it during the cold months when the stars pressed close and the dark felt hungry. They called it the weeping, the mourner, the sorrow that flies. They said its cries could strip leaves from trees. They said its sadness was a disease that could seep into your bones if you listened too long. They kept their children indoors when the sound rose from the canyon at night, a sound so vast and so broken that it didn't seem possible it could come from a living throat. They were wrong about one thing. It wasn't a monster. It was a dragon. And she was crying. Her name, if she still had one, if names even mattered anymore, had not been spoken aloud in 11 years. She had carried it once like a jewel between her ribs, bright and precious, given to her by her mother in the ancient tongue that dragons used before humans learned to write, before elves built their first silver towers, before the world had been carved into borders and boundaries and the ugly business of ownership. Her mother had spoken it into the shell before she hatched, whispering it through the calcium and warmth so that it was the very first vibration she ever knew. She could still feel that name somewhere inside her, buried beneath layers of grief so heavy they had their own gravity. But she didn't speak it anymore. Speaking it would mean remembering who she had been before everything went wrong, and remembering who she had been made the present unbearable. So she cried instead. Her tears fell into the black water at the bottom of the canyon, each one heavy enough to send ripples spreading outward like slow-motion earthquakes. The pool had grown because of her. What had once been a thin creek threading between the rocks was now a still, dark lake that reflected nothing, not the sliver of sky far above, not the pale stone walls, not even the dragon herself. It was as though the water had absorbed so much sorrow that it had become incapable of holding anything else. She lay curled on the largest shelf of rock beside the water, her massive body folded into a shape that was almost fetal if something that large could ever look so small. Her tail wrapped around her hindquarters. Her wings were pressed flat against her sides, not in the relaxed way a dragon might fold them while resting, but tight, deliberate, as though she was trying to make herself as compact as possible, as though she was trying to disappear. And perhaps she was. Because the most striking thing about her, the thing that would have stopped any observer dead, the thing that would have made poets weep and artists abandon every other subject for the rest of their lives, was that she was breathtakingly, impossibly, almost painfully beautiful. Her scales were not the crude armor that humans imagined when they thought of dragons. They were not the dull iron gray of war beasts or the mottled green of swamp worms. Each scale was a masterpiece of crystalline structure, layered and refractive, shifting between colors that had no names in any human language. In direct light, they would have blazed like stained glass in a cathedral, deep sapphire bleeding into violet, bleeding into a rose gold that seemed to come from somewhere warmer than the visible spectrum. Even here in the permanent twilight of the canyon floor, they held a luminosity that was almost spiritual, a soft inner glow that made her look less like a creature of flesh and bone and more like something that had been carved from solidified starlight and then given breath. Her head was long and elegant, tapering to a delicate muzzle that no fantasy illustrator had ever gotten right because human hands could not capture that particular intersection of power and grace. Two sweeping horns curved backward from her skull, black as obsidian and smooth as water, catching what little light reached the bottom of the canyon and holding it in their depths like frozen flames. Her eyes, when they were open, were enormous, amber gold with vertical pupils that could have swallowed the world. They were the kind of eyes that made you understand, instantly and irrevocably, that you were in the presence of an intelligence far older and deeper than your own. But her eyes were closed now. Because she was crying. The sound filled the canyon like weather. It was not the theatrical roaring that humans associated with dragons, not the fire and brimstone bellow that shook castle walls and scattered armies. It was quieter than that, and for that reason infinitely worse. It was a low, continuous moan that rose and fell with the slow rhythm of her breathing, punctuated by smaller sounds that were unmistakably sobs. Each sob resonated through the stone walls and was thrown back at her in a chorus of echoes, so that the canyon was full of her grief, surrounding her, inescapable. She had been crying for 11 years. Not continuously. Even dragons had to sleep, had to eat, had to drag themselves to the surface to hunt in the dead of night when no eyes could see her. But the crying always returned. It lived in her like a second heartbeat, pulsing beneath every waking moment, waiting for the smallest trigger, a memory, a scent, the angle of light on stone to crack her open again and let the grief pour through. She had cried when her mother died. She had cried when her sister was killed. She had cried when the last other dragon she knew, an ancient male named Thresun who had survived 3 centuries of human warfare by living in the deep places of the earth, had simply stopped breathing one night, his massive body going still beside her, his eyes open and empty and full of a resignation that she understood now because she felt it growing inside her like ice. She was the last. She knew this the way she knew her own heartbeat, the way she knew the temperature of the air on her scales, the way she knew the composition of the stone beneath her claws. She was the last dragon, the final note of a song that had been playing since before the mountains rose. And when she died, whether from grief or hunger or the slow accumulation of years that even dragons could not outrun forever, the song would end. No one would mourn it. That was the cruelest part, not the loneliness, not the loss, but the knowledge that the world would not even notice. Humans would continue building their cities and fighting their wars and telling their stories, and in those stories dragons would become myths, and then the myths would become fairy tales, and then the fairy tales would become things told to children before sleep, stripped of all truth, reduced to cardboard villains hoarding gold in caves. No one would know what dragons had really been. No one would know that they had sung to the stars. No one would know that they had named their children before they were born, whispering love into the dark. No one would know. And so she cried, and the canyon held her tears, and the world moved on without her. The human came on a Tuesday. It was, by any reasonable measure, the worst possible day for a human to be walking toward the Kalvari Reach. A cold front had moved down from the northern mountains, bringing with it a rain that was less like water and more like frozen needles, driven sideways by a wind that seemed to have a personal grudge against anything warm-blooded. The trails, what passed for trails in that desolate borderland, had turned to rivers of mud. The sky was the color of a bruise, pressing down on the earth with a weight that made the landscape feel like it was being slowly suffocated. But Maren Elswick was walking anyway. She was 34 years old, which the village she had left behind considered far too old for the kind of wandering she was doing. She was neither tall nor short, neither thin nor broad, the kind of person who could stand in a crowd and vanish entirely. Her hair was brown and cut short for practicality. Her face was weathered in a way that suggested years of outdoor work, deep lines around gray-green eyes, a permanently sun-browned complexion, a small scar on her chin from a childhood fall that she couldn't remember but wore like a signature. She wore a battered leather coat that had been patched so many times it was more stitched than original material, sturdy boots that had been resoled twice, and carried a pack that was lighter than it should have been because she had run out of food 2 days ago and hadn't bothered to forage. She was not running toward something. She was running away from something. Or perhaps she had finished running away and was now simply existing in the space that running left behind, a flat, directionless emptiness that was not quite peace and not quite despair, but some unnamed third thing that sat in the chest like a stone. Her mother had died 6 months ago. Not dramatically, not poetically. Cancer, the doctors said, as though that single word was an explanation rather than a surrender. It had started in her lungs and spread with the quiet efficiency of something that had done this many times before and knew exactly what it was doing. Maren had sat beside the hospital bed for 17 days, watching the woman who had raised her alone, who had worked 2 jobs, who had sung off-key lullabies, who had driven 40 miles in a snowstorm to bring Maren's forgotten lunch to school, slowly become a stranger in her own body. On the last night, her mother had looked at her with eyes that were still bright, still furious, still absolutely unwilling, and had said, "Don't you dare fall apart over this, Maren Elswick. I didn't raise you to be the kind of person who falls apart." Maren had nodded. She had held her mother's hand. She had not cried because her mother had asked her not to, and because Maren had spent her entire life being the kind of person who did what was asked of her. Then her mother had died and Maren had walked out of the hospital, and she had not stopped walking. She left her job, she let the lease on her apartment expire. She packed a single bag and pointed herself at the most empty, most remote, most nothing place she could find on the map, which happened to be the borderland near the Kalvari Reach, where the population density dropped to roughly 0 and the landscape became a study in desolation. She didn't know what she was looking for. She didn't think she was looking for anything. She just needed to be somewhere that didn't remind her of anything, and the empty places were good for that. Except the empty places had their own sounds. She first heard it on the 3rd night, camped in a shallow depression behind a windbreak of stunted trees. The rain had stopped, but the wind was still moving, and the temperature had dropped low enough that her breath came out in clouds. She had been staring at the small fire she'd managed to build, a pathetic, sputtering thing that seemed almost embarrassed to exist when the sound reached her. It was distant, very distant, but it cut through the wind the way a knife cuts through cloth, cleanly, precisely, with no reduction in force. It was a low, wavering note that rose and fell like breathing, and beneath it, almost too low to hear, a harmonic vibration that she felt more in her sternum than in her ears. She knew immediately what it was. Everyone in this region knew. A dragon. The knowledge should have frightened her. Dragons were dangerous. Even the stories that painted them sympathetically, the ones that called them noble and ancient and misunderstood, still acknowledged that a creature the size of a house that could breathe fire was, by any definition, dangerous. The rational response was to pack up, move in the opposite direction, and find somewhere else to be empty. Marin sat still and listened. The sound went on for hours. It stopped sometime before dawn, and in the silence that followed, Marin realized that she had been crying. Not sobbing, she hadn't made a sound, but her face was wet and her chest ached, and the stone that lived behind her ribs felt heavier than it had in months. She recognized the sound, not the dragon's sound, her own. It was the sound she had been making in her head for 6 months, the sound that she had swallowed and suppressed and buried because her mother had told her not to fall apart. It was grief. Raw, undiluted, unprocessed grief, and the dragon, this enormous, mythical, terrifying creature, was producing it with a fidelity that no human throat could match. And Marin had heard it, and something inside her had resonated like a tuning fork struck against its matching pitch. She didn't move on the next morning. She stayed for 3 more days, and each night the sound came again, and each night Marin sat in the dark and let it wash through her. On the 4th night, she made a decision that she would later be unable to explain to anyone, including herself. She got up from her camp, put on her coat, and started walking toward the canyon. It took her most of the next day to find it. The terrain was brutal, loose scree, hidden ravines, ground that looked solid but crumbled underfoot. The cold had settled into her bones with the permanence of a tenant who had no intention of leaving. Her boots slipped on wet rock. Her hands, shoved into her pockets for warmth, were numb. Twice she had to stop and rest because the wind stole her breath faster than her lungs could replace it. But she found it. The canyon opened at her feet without warning, the ground simply ending, dropping away into nothing. She stopped less than a foot from the edge and looked down. She couldn't see the bottom. The walls were sheer, the stone pale gray and wet with seeping water, disappearing into darkness long before they reached whatever floor the canyon had. Mist filled the space below, thick and sluggish, moving with the patience of something that had nowhere to be. The sound was louder here, much louder, rising from the depths like heat shimmer, but she still couldn't see the source. There was a path, not a good one. A narrow, crumbling ledge that switched back down the eastern wall, probably created by water erosion over centuries, barely wide enough for one person. In good weather, in good condition, with good equipment, it would have been merely dangerous. In the current conditions, with Marin's current state of exhaustion and cold, it was arguably suicidal. She started down. The descent took 2 hours. Twice she had to press herself flat against the wall when the wind gusted hard enough to push her sideways. Once a section of ledge crumbled under her foot and she caught herself with her hands, hanging for a moment over the void before finding purchase again. Her fingers bled, her knees shook, she did not stop. And then she was at the bottom. The canyon floor was a rough shelf of stone, maybe 100 yards wide, flanked on both sides by the towering walls. The air was still here, completely still, as though the canyon had swallowed the wind. The temperature was slightly warmer, the stone radiating a faint geothermal heat that seeped through the soles of her boots. And the mist was thinner here, hanging in wisps rather than clouds, giving the space a dreamlike quality that made Marin feel as though she had stepped out of the real world and into somewhere else entirely. The lake occupied the center of the floor, its surface dark and perfectly still. And beside the lake, on a broad, flat shelf of rock that jutted out over the water, was the dragon. Marin stopped. Every thought she had ever had about dragons, every illustration, every movie, every story, every fragment of cultural mythology that had accumulated in her brain over 3 decades of being alive, evaporated in a single instant, replaced by something raw and immediate and overwhelming. She was beautiful. That was the first and only word Marin's mind could produce, repeating it like a skipping record. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. The dragon's scales caught even the faintest light and refracted it into colors that Marin's eyes had never processed before, as though the creature existed partially in a spectrum that human vision wasn't designed to perceive. The curves of her body were flawless, not in the sterile way of mathematical perfection, but in the way of something that had been shaped by a love so vast and so patient that every line and angle was exactly where it was supposed to be. She was also enormous. Even curled up, she was larger than Marin's childhood home. Her head alone was the size of a car, resting on her folded forelimbs, her horns sweeping back like the arches of a cathedral. Her wings, pressed against her sides, were vast folded sails of translucent membrane threaded with veins that pulsed faintly with some inner light. And she was shaking. Marin could see it from where she stood 40 feet away, a fine, continuous tremor that ran through the dragon's entire body, the way a person shivers when they're crying too hard to control their muscles. The sound was deafening here, filling the enclosed space of the canyon floor with a wall of grief that pressed against Marin's chest like a physical force. The dragon's eyes were closed, and her jaw was slightly open, and from her throat came that low, anguished moan, and each moan ended in a sound that Marin could only describe as a whimper. A whimper. Something that large, that magnificent, that ancient was whimpering. And every instinct Marin had, every survival instinct, every rational impulse, every piece of common sense that had kept her alive for 34 years, told her to turn around and climb back out of the canyon and never come back. Instead, she took a step forward. Then another. Then another. The dragon didn't react. Either she didn't hear Marin over the sound of her own crying, or she didn't care, or she was too deep in her grief to register anything from the outside world. Marin kept walking, her boots making soft scraping sounds on the stone, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat, her palms sweating despite the cold. She reached the edge of the rock shelf where the dragon lay. Up close, the creature was even more overwhelming. Marin could see the individual scales now, each one the size of her hand, perfectly shaped, overlapping in patterns that seemed to shift and flow like living mosaics. She could see the dragon's breathing, the slow expansion and contraction of her ribcage, each breath moving enough air to fill a room. She could see the tears. They were falling from beneath the closed eyelids, sliding down the scaled cheeks in thick streams that caught the faint light and glittered. They were not like human tears. They were denser, more viscous, almost like liquid glass, and where they hit the rock they left small crystalline deposits that sparkled in the darkness. The stone around the dragon's head was encrusted with them, a growing crown of frozen sorrow that would have been stunningly beautiful if it weren't so heartbreaking. Marin stood there for a long moment, looking at the dragon, and the dragon did not look at her. And then Marin did something that she would never be able to fully explain. Something that came from a place deeper than thought, deeper than reason, deeper than the careful architecture of self-protection she had built around herself over 34 years of being alive. She sat down. Not cautiously, not slowly, not with the careful calculation of someone approaching a dangerous animal. She simply sat down right there on the rock shelf about 3 feet from the dragon's head, her legs dangling over the edge toward the water, her back against nothing, her hands resting in her lap. She sat down the way you'd sit next to a friend on a bench, casual and unhesitant, as though this were the most natural thing in the world. The dragon's crying hitched. It was subtle, a tiny interruption in the rhythm of her sobs, a fractional change in pitch like a record skipping. Her massive head shifted just slightly, the tip of her snout turning a few degrees toward Marin, but her eyes stayed closed. Marin didn't move, she didn't speak, she didn't reach out. She just sat there, breathing in and out, watching the mist drift over the dark water, feeling the dragon's body heat radiating toward her like a furnace, listening to the echoes of grief bouncing off the canyon walls. Seconds passed, minutes, the dragon's breathing slowed slightly. The moaning continued, but it was quieter now, less raw, as though the creature was trying to modulate itself, trying perhaps not to frighten the small thing that had sat beside her. Marin's chest ached. The stone behind her ribs was pressing harder than ever, and she realized with a sudden and terrible clarity that she couldn't hold it anymore. She had been holding it for 6 months, the grief, the anger, the hollow vacuum that her mother's death had left in the center of her life. And she had held it because she was Marin Elswick, and Marin Elswick didn't fall apart because her mother had told her not to, because she was strong and capable and the kind of person who handled things. But she was sitting beside a dragon that was crying, and the dragon was not handling things, and the dragon was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, and the dragon was the last of her kind, and the dragon was alone, and Marin thought, "We are the same, you and I, we are exactly the same." She started to cry. It was not dramatic. There were no sobs, no wailing, no theatrical collapse. The tears simply came, sliding down her weathered face, falling from her chin onto the stone beneath her, joining the dragon's tears in the growing crust of crystal. She cried silently, the way she had done in the hospital corridor after the nurses asked her to step out, the way she had done in her empty apartment surrounded by boxes she never unpacked, the way she had done in her sleeping bag in the wilderness with no one to hear. She cried, and she sat beside the dragon, and the dragon cried too. The canyon held them both. The dragon opened her eyes. It happened slowly, the way sunrise happens over mountains, not all at once but in gradual stages, the lids parting by degrees to reveal a thin crescent of amber gold that widened as her eyes focused on the world outside her grief. She turned her head fully this time, bringing that enormous, elegant skull around to face Marin, and Marin felt the weight of that gaze like a physical thing, a warm pressure against her skin, an inquiry that reached past her eyes and into whatever was behind them. The dragon's pupil, a vertical slit of absolute black, surrounded by that blazing amber, contracted slightly as it focused on Marin. She could see her own reflection in it, tiny and distorted, a smudge of brown and leather against the vast darkness of the dragon's eye. The crying had stopped, both of them. The canyon was silent for the first time in 11 years, and the silence was so complete, so absolute, that Marin could hear the blood moving through her own veins. The dragon looked at hers. Marin looked at the dragons. Neither of them moved. Then very slowly, with the careful deliberation of someone handling something impossibly fragile, the dragon extended her neck. Her head moved toward Marin, lowering itself from its great height, coming down through the space between them with a grace that defied her size. Marin's breath stopped. Every nerve in her body was screaming at her to run, to flinch, to do something, but she sat perfectly still, her hands flat on the rock, her tears still wet on her face, and watched as the dragon's head came to rest on the stone beside her. Not touching her, not quite. The dragon's snout was inches from Marin's thigh, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from it, close enough that she could see the texture of the scales, smoother than she'd imagined, almost like polished stone with a faint iridescence that shifted between blue and violet and gold. She could see the dragon's nostrils, each one large enough to put her fist inside, flaring slightly as the creature breathed. She could see, just at the corner of one enormous eye, a single tear still clinging to the scales, refracting what little light existed into a tiny prism of color. The dragon exhaled. It was a long, slow breath, warm and steady, and it washed over Marin like a wave, carrying with it a scent that she had no frame of reference for, not animal, not mineral, not anything she could name. It smelled of deep places, of stone that had not seen sunlight in millennia, of rain that had fallen on mountains before humans existed, of something clean and ancient and impossibly far from the world she knew. Marin lifted her hand. She did it slowly, giving the dragon every opportunity to pull away, to bare her teeth, to do any of the things that a creature of her size and power could do to a human who got too close. Her fingers were still numb from the cold. They were shaking. She was shaking, her whole body trembling with a mixture of terror and something else, something that felt dangerously close to tenderness. She placed her hand on the dragon's snout. The scales were warm, warmer than she expected, almost hot, and beneath them she could feel the subtle movement of muscle and blood, the great engine of the dragon's body humming at a frequency that she felt in her bones. The surface was impossibly smooth, smoother than glass, smoother than water, and her fingers slid across it with an ease that made her feel like she was touching something holy. The dragon didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. She didn't make a sound. But something changed. Marin felt it, a shift in the creature's breathing, a release of tension that had been so constant, so all-encompassing that she had only registered it subconsciously until it was gone. It was like watching a dam crack, not the catastrophic failure that sends a flood, but the small, almost invisible fractures that let the pressure bleed off in thin streams. The dragon exhaled again, longer this time, and the breath came out shuddering, and Marin realized with a start that the dragon was trying not to cry again. So Marin did what she had done for no one in 6 months, what she had been unable to do even for herself. She leaned forward and wrapped her arms as far around the dragon's snout as they would reach, which was not far at all. Her arms could barely span a quarter of its circumference, and she held on. She held on the way she had wanted to hold her mother in that hospital room, but hadn't because she was afraid of breaking something, of making it real, of letting the grief in. She held on the way she had held her childhood pillow during thunderstorms, with the desperate, absolute grip of someone who has found the one solid thing in a world that won't stop shaking. The dragon made a sound. Not the moan, not the sob. It was something else entirely, a low, resonant hum that Marin felt more than heard, vibrating through the dragon's snout and into her hands and up her arms and into her chest, where it settled against the stone behind her ribs and for the first time in 6 months made the stone feel lighter. The dragon was purring. A creature that could level mountains, that could fly through thunderstorms as though they were mild breezes, that carried within her a grief so vast it had reshaped the geology of the land, was purring. Like a cat. Like something small and soft and domestic, something that could fit in your lap, something that had never known loss. Except she had known loss. She had known more loss than Marin could imagine, loss on a scale that dwarfed anything a single human life could contain. She had lost her entire species. She had lost her family, her heritage, her language, her future, her purpose. She had lost everything except the tears and the canyon and the dark water that held them both. And a human had sat beside her. A small, fragile, short-lived, warm-blooded human who was, by every measure of the universe, insignificant, a flicker of consciousness that would burn for a few decades and then go out, leaving barely any mark on the world at all. A human who was, by the dragon's own ancient standards, barely more than a child, a species so young that its entire civilization was a rounding error in the span of dragon memory. And that human had sat down beside her and cried with her and put her tiny, inadequate, shaking arms around her enormous snout, and held on as though holding on was enough. It was enough. They stayed like that for a long time. Marin didn't know how long. Time didn't work the same way in the canyon. The darkness was constant. The air was warm. The dragon's purring was a steady vibration that Marin felt in every cell of her body, a frequency that seemed to synchronize with her own heartbeat, slowing it, steadying it, pulling her down into a calm that she had not known since before her mother got sick. Eventually, after minutes or hours or years, she couldn't tell, the dragon shifted. Very gently, with a carefulness that was almost inconceivable given her size, she lifted her head, sliding Marin's arms off her snout. Marin let go reluctantly, her fingers trailing across the smooth scales, feeling the warmth fade as the distance between them increased. The dragon looked at her again. Those amber gold eyes, vast and deep and full of an intelligence that made Marin feel like a child looking up at the night sky, studied her with an intensity that should have been frightening but wasn't. There was something in those eyes that Marin recognized because she had seen it in her own mirror, had seen it in the faces of other grieving people she had encountered in hospital waiting rooms and funeral homes and support groups she had attended exactly once before walking out. It was the look of someone who had been drowning and had just been thrown a rope. The dragon opened her mouth. What came out was not a sound Marin had ever heard before. It was not the moaning, not the crying, not the purring. It was something structured, something deliberate, a series of tones and vibrations that rose and fell in patterns that were too complex to be random. It was language. Actual language spoken in a voice that was deeper than any human voice, deeper than whale song, deeper than the rumble of tectonic plates, a voice that seemed to come from the center of the earth itself. Marin didn't understand a single word. But she understood the tone, she understood the cadence. She understood the way the sounds bent and curved around each other, the way pauses were placed, the way certain tones were held longer than others. It was a question, or perhaps a statement. Or perhaps something for which human language had no equivalent, something that existed only in the grammar of grief and gratitude, something that meant, "Why are you here, and thank you for being here, and how did you know, and I didn't know anyone could do this, and I am so tired, and I don't want to be alone anymore." Marin couldn't answer in the dragon's language. She didn't have the vocal range, the anatomical structures, the centuries of linguistic evolution that had produced those sounds. But she could do something else. She could speak human. "I lost my mom," she said. Her voice was rough, unused, cracked from disuse and cold and tears. It sounded pathetically small in the vast space of the canyon, a thin reed of sound against the stone. "6 months ago, she told me not to fall apart, so I didn't. I just stopped. I stopped feeling anything. I walked out here because I didn't want to feel anything anymore, and then I heard you and—" She paused, swallowed. The dragon was watching her with those enormous eyes, and Marin had the inexplicable feeling that the creature understood every word, even if the words themselves were meaningless to her. "I heard you crying," Marin continued, "and I thought, I don't know what I thought. I thought maybe if I came down here I would feel something, and I did. I felt this." She gestured vaguely at her chest, at her wet face, at the crystalline deposits of dragon tears that surrounded them both. "All of this, and it hurt, it still hurts, but it's better than nothing, it's better than being empty." She looked at the dragon, really looked past the scales and the size and the otherness, into the eyes that held the weight of an entire extinct species. "You're not empty," she said. "I know that now. You feel everything. That's why it hurts so much, because you feel all of it for all of them. But that means they're still here somewhere inside you, every dragon that ever lived, every song they sang, every name they whispered into the dark. You're carrying all of it, and that's not nothing, that's everything." The dragon made a sound, a single soft note barely above a whisper that resonated in the still air of the canyon and then faded into silence. It was not a word, it was not a question. It was acknowledgement, pure and simple, the sound of being seen, being heard, being understood by something that had no reason to understand and every reason not to try. Then the dragon lowered her head again, slowly, carefully, and this time she pressed the side of her snout against Marin's shoulder. Gently, with a pressure so light that Marin could have pushed it away with one hand, though the idea of pushing it away was now unthinkable. The dragon's breath was warm against her neck. Her scales were smooth against Marin's cheek. And the purring started again, that deep subsonic vibration that seemed to reach past Marin's body and into the rock beneath her, into the water below, into the walls of the canyon itself, filling the entire space with a hum that felt less like sound and more like the fundamental frequency of the universe. The note that had existed before anything else, the note that would continue after everything else was gone. Marin closed her eyes. She let herself fall apart. Not dramatically, not loudly. She simply stopped holding the stone in her chest and it dissolved, and everything she had been suppressing for 6 months came flooding in, the grief, the rage, the love, the gratitude, the terrible aching beauty of having had someone worth missing. the unbearable weight of knowing that person was gone and that the world had continued without them as though nothing had happened. She cried, and the dragon held her, not with arms. Dragons didn't hold that way, but with presence, with warmth, with the steady rumbling of a purr that said, "I am here, I am here, I am here." The canyon held them both, and the dark water held their tears, and the stone held the resonance of the dragon's song, and somewhere in the vast indifferent universe, two small points of warmth pressed together against the dark and refused for one night to go out. Marin fell asleep. She didn't mean to. The warmth, the purring, the emotional collapse, it all conspired to pull her down into a sleep so deep and so sudden that she was unconscious before she realized it was happening. Her body slumped sideways, coming to rest against the dragon's snout, her cheek pressed against the smooth scales, her breath evening out into the slow rhythm of genuine rest. The dragon felt the change immediately, the human's heartbeat slowing, her breathing deepening, the tiny body going limp against her snout. She held perfectly still, not daring to move, not daring to breathe too hard, because she understood with a clarity that transcended language that this human had given her something precious and fragile, and to break it now would be an unforgivable betrayal. So the dragon lay still and the human slept, and for the first time in 11 years the canyon was silent. Not the heavy silence of grief, not the oppressive silence of absence, but a warm silence, a living silence, the silence of two creatures who had found in each other something that neither had been looking for and both had desperately needed. The dragon watched the human sleep. She studied the small face, the weathered skin, the short brown hair, the scar on the chin. She studied the way the human's hands were curled loosely against her chest, the fingers still faintly stained with the crystalline residue of dragon tears. She studied the rise and fall of the human's breathing, so much faster than her own, so much smaller, so much more urgent, the breathing of a creature that burned through its life quickly, fiercely, like a candle in a drafty room. She thought about what the human had said. She had understood more than the human probably realized. Not the words were in a language she had never learned, though she had listened to humans speak for centuries and could parse their emotional content from tone and rhythm alone. But the meaning behind the words, the truth beneath the syntax, that she had understood perfectly, because it was her truth too. I lost my mom. The dragon had lost her mother too, 312 years ago, to a wound from a human spear that had festered for weeks before finally killing her. The dragon had been young then, barely a century old, still learning the contours of her own grief, still believing that loss was something you moved past rather than something you carried. She had cried for her mother and then she had stopped crying and she had believed the stopping meant healing. It didn't. It meant the grief had just gone deeper, settling into her bones like sediment, waiting for the next loss to crack the surface and let it rise again. I didn't want to feel anything anymore. She knew that feeling. She had lived in that feeling for decades, building walls of silence and solitude around herself, retreating further and further from the world as each loss compounded the last. When Thresun died, the last other dragon, the final thread connecting her to anything larger than herself, the walls had closed completely, and she had come to this canyon, and she had cried, and she had not stopped. You're not empty, you feel everything. The dragon closed her eyes. She felt the human's warmth against her snout, the small, steady heartbeat, the impossibly light pressure of a body that weighed less than one of her claws. She felt the stone beneath her, the air around her, the water below her. She felt the crystalline tears beneath her head, the accumulated sorrow of 11 years made solid and beautiful, a terrible crown that she had built without knowing it. She felt everything. The human was right. She was not empty. She was the opposite of empty. She was so full of feeling that it had become unbearable, so full of loss that every breath was weighted with the memory of everyone she had ever loved and lost, so full of beauty that the beauty itself had become a kind of pain. But maybe, and this was a thought so new, so foreign, so alien to the landscape of her grief that it felt like a light turning on in a room that had been dark for years, maybe that was not a weakness. Maybe that was the point. Maybe the reason dragons had sung to the stars was not because they were happy. Maybe they had sung because they felt everything, all of it, the joy and the sorrow and the beauty and the loss, and the singing was the only way to contain it, the only way to keep it from destroying them. Maybe the songs had been a way of saying, I am here, I feel this, I am alive, and that matters even though it hurts. Maybe the crying was a kind of singing too. The dragon opened her eyes and looked at the sleeping human, and she felt something she had not felt in 11 years, not happiness, not peace, something more complicated than either, something that contained both and was larger than both. Something that humans probably had a word for because humans had words for everything, even the things that didn't deserve words. Gratitude maybe, or hope, or love, the kind that doesn't ask for anything, doesn't expect anything, doesn't need to be reciprocated or understood or even acknowledged. The kind that simply exists warm and steady like a purr in the dark. She lowered her head a fraction more, adjusting her position with infinite care so that the human was cradled against the curve of her neck, sheltered from the cold air by the warmth of her body. She wrapped the tip of her tail around the human's feet, not tight enough to restrain but snug enough to anchor, a loop of scaled muscle that said, "You are safe here, you are held, you are not alone." And then, for the first time in 11 years, the dragon closed her eyes and slept. She dreamed of her mother. Not of the dying, never of the dying. She dreamed of before. Of the high rocky ledge where she had hatched, overlooking a valley that was green with a green that didn't exist anymore, a green that humans had paved and plowed and built over until nothing remained but the memory of green. She dreamed of her mother's voice speaking her name into the shell and of the warmth that had surrounded her, and of the first breath she had taken, a breath that had tasted like stone and sky and possibility. She dreamed of her sister, who had been smaller than her, louder than her, braver than her, who had challenged a human hunting party to protect a nest of flightless birds that weren't even her own species, who had died with fire in her throat and fury in her eyes, and who had never, not once, not for a single moment, been ashamed of feeling as much as she did. She dreamed of Thresun, ancient and patient and tired, who had lived long enough to see the end of everything, and had met it with a sigh rather than a roar, not because he didn't care, but because he cared so much that the caring had worn him smooth like a river stone. All the sharp edges of grief polished away by centuries of loss until what remained was something simple and pure: acceptance. She dreamed of songs, hundreds of songs, thousands, the entire musical heritage of her species, rising from the depths of her memory like bubbles from deep water. Songs of flight and fire, songs of birth and death, songs that celebrated the turning of seasons and the movement of stars, songs that mourned fallen kin and lost homelands and the slow, inexorable passage of time. Songs that were happy and sad and angry and peaceful, and everything in between and nothing at all except pure, undiluted feeling given voice. She dreamed of all of it and none of it hurt, because in the dream she was not carrying it alone. The human was there. Not as a human in the dream, the boundary between them was blurred, their identities overlapping like watercolors. The human's grief was woven into the dragon's grief, and the dragon's songs were woven into the human's silences, and together they made something that neither could have made alone. A harmony, a chord, a single sustained note that was richer and fuller and more beautiful than any note either of them could have produced by themselves. The dragon understood in the dream what the human had done. The human had not cured her grief. Grief could not be cured. It was not a disease to be eradicated, but a testament to be honored, proof that she had loved, that she had been loved, that the ones she had lost had mattered. The human had not taken away her pain. She had simply sat beside it, her own pain pressed close, her small, warm presence saying, "I see you, I hear you, you are not alone in this, and that is enough." It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Marin woke to warmth. She was surrounded by it, not the ambient warmth of geothermal stone, but a concentrated, directed heat that pressed against her from every side. She opened her eyes and saw, inches from her face, the soft blue-violet glow of dragon scales, and memory came flooding back in a single overwhelming wave. She was lying against the dragon's neck. The dragon's tail was around her feet. The dragon was awake, Marin could tell by the subtle shift in the purring, which had continued through the night and was still going, a low, steady hum that she could feel in her teeth. "Good morning," Marin whispered. The dragon's purring shifted pitch. It was a small change, barely perceptible, but Marin had been listening to it for hours and she understood it the way you understand the inflections of a language you're learning, not with precision but with intuition. The shift meant, "I heard you." The shift meant, "You're awake." The shift meant something that might have been, in the dragon's ancient tongue, the equivalent of good morning, or it might have been something for which no human equivalent existed. Marin sat up slowly, her body protesting after a night spent on bare stone. She ached everywhere. Her hands were stiff, the cuts from yesterday's descent crusted with dried blood. Her face felt tight with the residue of dried tears. She was hungry and cold and probably in the early stages of hypothermia and absolutely unequivocally entirely at peace. She looked at the dragon. The dragon looked at her. In the faint ambient light of the canyon, where did it come from? There was no visible source, but the space was not completely dark, and Marin realized with a start that the dragon's scales were producing it, a soft bioluminescence that cast the canyon floor in shades of blue and violet. The dragon's face was different than it had been yesterday. The tension was gone. The grief was still there. Marin could see it in the depth of those amber eyes, in the faint shimmer of unshed tears, in the weariness that no amount of sleep could fully erase. But it was no longer the only thing there. Beside it, woven through it, was something else. Curiosity. The dragon was looking at Marin the way a person looks at something they've just discovered, with wonder, with interest, with the particular kind of attention that transforms an object into a subject. She was seeing Marin, not as a human, not as a species, not as a brief flicker of consciousness in an indifferent universe, but as a person, as someone who mattered. Marin understood then what she had done, or rather what had been done through her. She had not saved the dragon. She was not capable of saving the dragon. The dragon's grief was too large, too old, too fundamental to be resolved by a single night of shared tears. But she had done something that might, in the long reckoning of things, matter more than saving. She had witnessed. She had sat down beside the most beautiful creature she had ever seen, and she had not run, and she had not tried to fix it, and she had not offered platitudes or solutions or the well-meaning but ultimately useless comfort that people offered to the grieving. She had simply been there, present. Human, small and fragile and insignificant and alive, radiating the particular warmth that came from being a creature that felt things and was not afraid to show it. That was what the dragon had needed, not a solution, not a cure, a witness. Marin reached out and placed her hand on the dragon's snout again. The scales were still warm, still impossibly smooth, still alive with that deep subsonic pulse that she felt in her bones. The dragon leaned into her touch just slightly, and the purring deepened. "I can't stay," Marin said softly. "I'm human, I have to go back eventually. I have to eat and sleep in a bed and do human things. But I can come back, I will come back if you want me to." The dragon made a sound, not a word, not in any language Marin could identify. It was a single clear note, pure and resonant, that filled the canyon and hung in the air like a held breath. It was the most beautiful sound Marin had ever heard. It was not sad, it was not happy. It was both and neither. It was the sound of a dragon who had been crying for 11 years, choosing, for one moment, to sing instead. Then the dragon shifted, pulling her head back, and Marin felt the warmth recede. The dragon stood slowly, carefully, each movement a study in controlled power, and unfolded her wings. They spread outward, filling the canyon from wall to wall, and the membrane caught the light from her scales and blazed with color, sapphire and violet and rose gold, and a dozen other shades that human eyes were not designed to process. And Marin looked up at those wings and understood, with a certainty that bypassed thought entirely, that this was what the world had lost when the dragons disappeared. This beauty, this scale of beauty, this kind of feeling made manifest in flesh and bone and light. The dragon looked down at Marin one last time. Those amber eyes held hers, and in them Marin saw everything, the grief and the gratitude and the ancient loneliness, and the new, tentative, terrifyingly fragile thing that might someday grow into hope. She saw the last dragon, and the last dragon saw her, and between them passed something that did not require language or gesture or even thought. Then the dragon spread her wings wider, and the air in the canyon surged, and she rose. She rose straight up, vertical, a column of light and color ascending between the canyon walls with a power that turned the mist into spirals and sent the dark water into waves. Marin was knocked backward by the downdraft, her hair whipping, her coat flapping, her hands over her eyes to protect them from the wind. She felt the sound as much as heard it, a deep, resonant boom that shook the stone beneath her and echoed off the walls and rolled outward across the landscape like thunder. She lowered her hands and looked up. The dragon was above the canyon now, silhouetted against the bruised sky, her wings spread to their full extent, each one wider than the canyon itself, it seemed, wider than anything had a right to be. She hung there for a moment, motionless, suspended between the earth and the clouds, and the light from her scales turned the sky around her into a halo of shifting color that was visible for miles. Then she sang. It came down from above like rain, like light, like something that had no business existing in a world as hard and pragmatic as the one Marin knew. It was not the moaning of grief. It was not the purring of comfort. It was a song, a real song, complex and layered and structured, with melodies that wove through each other like rivers joining the sea, with harmonics that reached frequencies Marin could feel in her internal organs, with rhythms that matched the beating of her heart and then slowly, gently changed it. It was a song of loss, a song of grief, a song that acknowledged every tear that had ever been cried in this canyon, every moment of loneliness, every dark night when the silence had been unbearable. But it was also a song of witness, a song that said, "Someone sat beside me," a song that said, "I am not alone," a song that said, "The grief remains, but it no longer fills the entire space. There is room now for something else. There is room now for beauty." The song faded slowly, the dragon's voice diminishing by degrees as she turned and flew north, toward the mountains, toward whatever future a last dragon could have in a world that had forgotten her kind. The light from her scales receded, the colors in the sky dimmed, and then she was gone, a speck, a memory, a warmth fading from Marin's skin. The canyon was silent. Marin sat on the rock shelf beside the dark water, surrounded by a crown of crystallized dragon tears, and she listened to the silence. It was not empty. It was full of echoes, full of resonance, full of the ghost of a song that would live in these walls long after Marin was gone. She reached down and picked up one of the crystalline deposits. It was lighter than she expected, warm in her palm, and when she held it up to the faint light it blazed with color, sapphire, violet, rose gold, the colors of the most beautiful dragon ever seen. A dragon's tears frozen into something permanent, something that would last. She closed her fingers around it and held it to her chest. Then she stood up, shouldered her pack, and began the long climb out of the canyon. She had things to do, she had a life to rebuild. She had phone calls to return and bills to pay and a world to rejoin. She had grief to carry, her own and a small, precious fraction of a dragon's, and she would carry it the way the dragon did, not as a burden but as a testament, not as a weakness but as proof that she had loved something worth missing. But she would come back. She had promised. And somewhere in the mountains, flying through clouds that turned to stained glass in the light of her scales, the last dragon sang a new song. It was quiet, almost inaudible, a whisper of sound that the wind carried and scattered. But if you listened, really listened, with the kind of attention that transforms hearing into understanding, you could hear it. It was a song with a human's name in it. A small name, a short name. A plain and ordinary name, brown-haired and weather-faced and unremarkable in every way except one. It was the name of someone who sat down. And that was enough.